Okay, so if you'll bear with me for about 8 minutes, I just have some introductory material to share, and then I have a question based on something one of the authors of the articles I posted said that I thought would be a good way to kick off the discussion. So, as you're aware, our topic today is the evolutionary psychology of guilt and shame, and it's to consider how they may have been adaptive, that is, how they enhanced fitness, and how they can go awry. Guilt and shame are closely related but different emotions. Guilt is tethered to a specific and time-limited act one commits or is thinking of committing. Shame, on the other hand, is a more global and permanent self-assessment of one's worth or lovability. In other words, guilt is about what you do. Shame is more about who you feel you are. With guilt, you think what I did is bad. With shame, you're more likely to think I am bad. Importantly, the same situation can trigger both emotions, but they are different. One way in which they're alike is that they're both social emotions and tied to the reactions of others. And as Diane's post and paper, that published paper that I posted, pointed out, guilt tends to be tied to anger from other people about what you did, and shame is tied more to disgust or contempt from other people about the kind of person you are. So, in keeping with its more global nature, shame is more tied to others' devaluation of you as a person. When you think of it, to say that someone is shameless means that they don't care what others think of them. We might say shame on you to someone, but you'd probably never say guilt on you to somebody because you can shame someone else, but it's hard to guilt someone else because guilt is more of a private feeling, sort of a self-administered punishment and deterrence. This is why shame is closely linked to humiliation and embarrassment, which are emotions experienced in front of others. When you say, I feel ashamed, you're expressing chagrin about how others perceive you. When you say, I feel guilty, you are more expressing how you perceive yourself. So, in classical Freudian theory, of course, guilt is your superego condemning your ego for letting the id get the upper hand. So, how are guilt and shame adaptive? First, they're both inhibitory emotions. That is, they prevent you from transgressing against a group norm or rule. Or failing that, they make you conceal a transgression already committed. So here we can speak of anticipatory guilt or anticipatory shame. They act like brakes in a car. I know I'll feel guilty if I were to cheat on my income tax, even if no one ever knows, so I don't. I know I will feel ashamed if I become intoxicated at the office Christmas party and everyone sees me making a fool of myself, so I'll limit my alcohol intake. Second way guilt and shame are adaptive is that they are both reparative emotions. To quote from the Rosenstock and O'Connor paper, guilt leads to a suite of reparative behaviors, including apology, gift giving, acceptance of punishment, and self-punishment. Expressions of guilt lead to decreased punishing behaviors and forgiveness by group members. Close quote. So after a transgression of a norm or a rule, you apologize, you make amends, you promise to yourself and others to do better going forward. Three of the most frequently uttered and important words in any language are, I am sorry, which is said after minor and even accidental transgressions. I am sorry I'm late, as well as major ones. I'm sorry I was unfaithful to you. Guilt and especially shame motivate you to repair social bonds, salvage your reputation, and remain a member in good standing of your group. They also motivate you to withdraw from activities that cause others to feel anger, disgust, or contempt toward you, and they thereby protect you from aggression or exclusion. In talking about how natural selection led us to have a psychological adaptation like shame, Cosmides and Tooby point out that a person who did only what others wanted would be selected against because they would be open to exploitation. On the other hand, a purely selfish person would be shunned. So natural selection led to a neural architecture which enables us to predict the rewards and costs of social transgressions and to inhibit us when the costs exceed the rewards. Their information threat theory of shame states that its inhibitory function requires us to have an internal cognitive map of what acts will trigger devaluation by others and to what degree. So when considering how to act, we weigh the direct payoff. For example, how much will I benefit by stealing this food against the costs? How much will others devalue me if I steal this food? And how likely is it others will find out? Their research also found that many of the behaviors that cause shame are universal. There is strong cross-cultural agreement in what people devalue in others. For example, stinginess, lack of ambition, and infidelity. And whenever you have cross-cultural universality, that suggests a biological adaptation. But culture does play a role. Shame itself is considered a less destructive and more valued emotion in collectivist rather than individualistic cultures because it ensures social control and harmony. Beyond that, there are obvious cultural differences in what specific behaviors cause shame. Consider premarital sex. In some cultures, it is deeply shameful, in others, moderately so, and in some, not at all. And the way I like to think of this is with Robert Wright's metaphors of knobs on a stereo. Nature gives all of us knobs labeled shame and guilt. But what behaviors turn the knobs and to what intensity they are set depends on culture. That is, the knob is tuned to what norm violations cause others in your group to devalue you or hold you in contempt. To wrap up, a few quick comments on how guilt and shame can go awry. When I worked as a therapist, I often saw clients struggling with guilt. Sometimes the guilt was appropriate, but it was prolonged. I would first reassure them that they would not want to live without guilt. We have a name for people who live without guilt. We call them psychopaths. Guilt is an adaptive emotion because it motivates you to repair social bonds and resolve to do better in the future. But once that motivational function has occurred, continued guilt is little more than self-flagellation. So to conclude, all adaptations can be considered disordered if they are one, deficient or excessive, or two, harmful. Think of sleep. A sleep disorder occurs when sleep is either too little or too much, and it causes impairment. Similarly, guilt and shame can become disordered if they are deficient or excessive in intensity or duration. My key point here is that guilt and shame are natural response mechanisms to social transgressions, and you would not want to live without these emotions. But they can become disordered if they're experienced in situations for which they were not designed, are of disproportionate intensity or duration relative to the initial provoking situation, or if they occur spontaneously with no external precipitant at all. So the question I wanted to toss it open with comes from the paper I wrote by Bregan. And I'm going to paraphrase a quote from that paper and then ask you to react to it. He writes, guilt and shame evolved to inhibit, restrain, disperse, and redirect the expression of willfulness, self-assertion, and violence in our personal and family relationships. However, they are weak inhibitors of aggression toward outsiders and strangers. Further, these emotions are reinforced in childhood before the age of reason and largely without regard for rational ethics. Subtle ethics are too complex to be genetically transmitted and selected by evolution. Therefore, and this is what I want you to maybe react to, guilt and shame cannot provide emotional guidance for making adult decisions. In maturity, he writes, guilt and shame need to be identified, rejected, and replaced with more positive guidelines, including reason, ethics, and empathy for others. Is he right about that? Is there no place for guilt and shame in adulthood? So thank you for your forbearance and listening to this, and I will try to manage the queue of comments. I thought Ken had either raise your real hand or your virtual hand. I see Ken, Andy, and Michael so far.
I'm going to jump right in and agree that that's the case. But that is because I think that he misses the point in the rest of this article. He doesn't really see the real source of guilt and shame. And as Steve has suggested, it's social. And it's social not in some ephemeral fashion. It's not Yasgur's farm in 1969. It's built into the genes. We began with a eusocial evolutionary pattern, and then this tribal nature evolved into us. We just want to constantly coalesce with groups, and social control there are two things that have groups that one had altruism, which evolved in naturally, and social control. And social control involves morality, and then guilt and shame are very useful in enforcing conformity to that. So that's where it came from. Now, it's pretty clear, and certainly is the goal of pro-social world, to decrease or eliminate inter-group competition. Therefore, the need for that kind of social control is going to disappear. So I would agree with him that indeed there is no, I mean, unless, we are going to have some sort of group. Yeah, we are going to have some sort of group association. Is just in a less conflicting fashion.
Another way, as I listen to you, Ken, another way to maybe paraphrase the question I posed is are guilt and shame an obstacle to creating a pro-social world or an ally to creating a pro-social world? So Andy, and then Michael, and then Rob, and then Diane. Andy, you're muted. And then Hank.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah,
Yep.
a nice presentation, Steve. Really
Thank you.
lot to think about there. You described guilt and shame as reparative, and I don't doubt that they function in that capacity. I'm wondering if you would agree that that can also be preventative of social breaches as well as reparative of. So if
Yeah.
I experience guilt or shame at the thought of doing something transgressive, I might avoid doing that transgressive.
I mentioned that inhibitory function, and you might have been, you signed on a bit late. It might have been, I was talking about anticipatory guilt, anticipatory shame, which I said it's like brakes in a car that can stop you from doing something. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. One other quick question. Did you make a reference in your introduction to the information threat theory of shame?
Yes.
I'm going to look that up. That sounds
If
fascinating.
there's a link to that in the post for today's session, and it goes to a UC Santa Barbara Center for Evolutionary Psychology page that has a description of that and links to articles about it.
Okay, thank you, Steve.
I think Michael was next.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm not a scholar, and so I'm coming at this from a more practical point of view. I would assert that both guilt and shame are inhibitive of risk-taking and transformation.
Mm.
And it starts with an experience that I had, having been raised and educated thoroughly as a Roman Catholic. And being in a monastery on my way to becoming a full-fledged monk. And one of the main things that we had was once a week we had the practice of confession, which is very closely connected to guilt. And I started finding confession, the whole experience of being like, I'm not, it's very hard to be in a monastery and go out and doing all kinds of sins, and became meaningless. So I stopped going, and then I felt guilty. So then I would start going again, and it was still meaningless, and I would stop going, et cetera, et cetera. This went on for over a year. And one evening, when everyone was going off to their confessors, I'm sitting in the choir where we did our chanting and all of that, wondering, like, well, what is this all about? And all of a sudden, the neon lights went on. You are feeling guilty because you don't
Yeah.
feel guilty.
Michael, you raise a really interesting aspect of this. Yesterday, when I finished typing up my introductory remarks, I had my wife take a look at them, and she said, "You're doing a session on guilt and shame, and there's nothing about religion." And and, and what- and so she's a lapsed Presbyterian, but she um, wanted to remind me that guilt and shame certainly have go along with religion to some degree.
But I
So
think that it goes way beyond religion because if you look at one of the major factors in the motivation to do something that is unusual, that cutting edge, you have to deal with, can you handle the negative consequences that are going to come from that? And that's going to be a lot of disapproval. And I don't
you,
know where you draw the line between shame and disapproval.
that's an excellent point. When I think about great scientific innovators, when they first said what they believed to be true, they met with a lot of shame from the scientific community. So you're making a good point there. Who did I say was next? I'm going to end with so many people in line here. I'm going to need, and I can only, for some reason on my screen, I cannot see everybody's hands. So this is going to be difficult for me. I think Diane was next.
It's
The
Ben,
hell?
Ben, and then Diane. I see.
And then Diane, help me out, Sage. Thank you.
Yeah.
Ben?
Yeah, thank you. I'm coming to this with a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old that I'm actively in this midst of guilt and shame. And I thought that this was a really appropriate uh, exercise and opportunity. Um, Personally, as well, guilt and shame, everything you said, really great review of that. I think the question is kind of absolutism. It's like yes or no versus developing the psychology of a person managing their own behavior and owning their own consequences, and all that guilt and shame have a real strong place. I have the two kids that I have. One is overly self-guilting, and he's highly influenceable, to the point where I have to like try to create a safe place where he can do things. Whereas the other one, water off the duck's back, absolute baked in resistance to any kind of shaming or self-guilting. He lives in denial, right? He'll write his own stories, he'll do all these things. And so yeah, at the end of the day, for my own personal journey, I'm like, okay, I have to let go of guilt and shame. I have to then move on and grow to the point of what is empathy. And without children, I don't know that I ever really would have experienced this
Yeah.
idea of unconditional responsibility for the love and well-being of another person. So
And if there's any role in life it's easy to feel guilty about is when you're a parent and you feel like you're making a mistake. You can feel guilty. What you're describing, of course, is what Freud would have called an overactive superego in one kid and an underactive superego in the other. And the trick is to tune that to some modulated middle ground, because
Yeah, and as
like I
a parent,
said,
you have to create that culture for each child differently. You can't just
Mm.
set it and forget it. It's a family culture,
Right.
each child, and then they compare to each other, and why is one person being treated differently? So it's a very active space, in
Yeah.
that way. But it's like, do we need that? Yes, we always need that. It comes free of charge. Like when you look at your emotions, these are incredibly valuable emotions, and they can teach you things about your environment. And if you don't listen to those things and admire those things and listen and try to respond, how are you ever supposed to get to empathy and altruism?
Yeah.
How are you ever supposed to develop yourself where you can actively choose? And I don't know whether I've never lived in a world, an emotional state where I don't have guilt and shame. I am working very hard to let go of it and grab onto empathy and altruism and a sense of interdependence with other people in a healthy way.
Right.
Otherwise, you live in guilt and shame constantly in codependency,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah, I'm going to I want to move on because we have a long queue, but I do think you're raising the issue of you said something quite interesting, which is that guilt and shame might be a bridge to developing empathy. You start with those more primitive instinctual emotions and go from there. Although there's research that shows that at about 18 months, babies will show some empathy for other people. Diane.
Yeah, the conversation is going in the direction of looking at the function of these two emotions in individual lives, but I would like to sort of broaden it out and say it seems to me that these are evolved facilities, you might say, that work in an overall system. The system being the one that ensures group cooperation, at least to the extent that the group is able to survive, let's say. and there are lots of different parts of it, not only shame and guilt, but also if you read the little excerpts that I sent to Hilo, but I think most people didn't. Things like anger and various kinds of blaming of other people, contempt, disgust, a lot of different negative emotions, either directed towards ourselves or directed towards other people. And they all have one major function, which is to get people in a group cooperating and to prevent too much harm to the group or to the individuals in the group, seems to me.
So you would not want to live,
So
you would not want to live in a group where everybody had no guilt and no shame.
absolutely not, because if they didn't, there would be nothing holding them back, right?
Okay.
On the other hand,
Okay.
they do hold us back, but so do other people's negative emotions towards us. Now, the Santa Barbara group makes a lot of the idea of devaluation by other people. That devaluation can come in lots of different forms, like anger or contempt or disgust or dislike or rejection, all of these things, which we don't like to be the target of for good enough reason. And so when we are the target, or we think we might be the target, then we try to do something that will forestall that.
At least if
And so
those are coming from people in our group, we care. We're a lot less reactive if somebody's angry at us from another group. But let me, in the interest of time, let me go on to Hank.
absolutely not. But okay.
Yep. Go ahead. Finish up, Diane, and then I'll go to Hank.
The idea of it's a system, and that's it.
Okay. Thank you. Hank.
Yeah, what a prolific topic and discussion. I mean, I guess we can do this for a year or two. But the part I want to see if I can get my focus well. Diane brought up, let me just see my little note. But I wanted to go, I usually go to the individual and family and group or couples, but here the focus that Diane brought is this sort of collective use of shame and guilt to influence. And I think we've been talking about it a little bit. So if you think about, there's always this issue about, are we biologically cooperative or competitive or aggressive? So I think in one of the authors says, well, we got them all. And so I'm suggesting, like many in pro-social and others, saying that it's the culture and the environment that shapes the genetic expression of violence, healthy competitiveness, unhealthy competitiveness, overly cooperative at the sense of giving up one's own opinion and critical thinking, as well as a healthy cooperation. So if you think about our modern America and the world that it's been around, we have, let's say we have two alliances. I don't want to call it politics. We have the group that uses harsh collective shaming and guilt producing techniques to get what they want. And then there's another group that uses a more sense of humanistic, cooperative, let's be pro-social and look out for the common good. So this is reminding me of what's going on in front of us, always has, but it's sort of large now.
Thank you, Hank. I think Rob is next.
I just wanted to say that I read quickly the Bregan article, and his main theme, as I extracted it, was negative legacy emotions. So guilt and shame are negative emotions. But he turned me off with the very first sentence of the abstract. Human beings are the most social and the most violent creatures on earth. I go social, ants and termites. I go violent, chimpanzees. Come on. What kind of a statement is that? So first of all, I don't think these are negative legacy emotions. I think they're emotions that obviously serve a function. We wouldn't have them if they didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Second of all, I forgot what my anyway, I've been dealing with the last year or so with grief. And I've discovered that in the grieving process, these emotions come up a lot, particularly anger and guilt. For instance, somebody might feel relieved that a loved one is gone. I've had 2 or 3 people tell me this. The suffering is over. They're no longer the burden that they were before. And then they feel incredible guilt for feeling the relief. And then they get angry because they're guilty about something that they feel is justified. And these emotions spin around and they're part of the grieving process. So I think it's very important that these emotions be given their space. I'm also of the generation that was taught that guilt is private and shame is public, and that there are different shame cultures and guilt cultures. And I think that's true. I mean, I think Japan was referred to as a shame culture, that they social control is very important. And the saying that they have, if the nail sticks up, hammer it down. So you don't want to stand out. Keeps everything tranquil and under control. And I have to say, the first time I went to Japan, I was on the subway and looking out over this sea of people, and I felt no intrusion from other people at all, even though they're packed in. It was just a kind of group.
Yeah, I did mention that shame operates somewhat differentially in collectivist cultures rather than individualistic cultures. So you're kind of experience that in a very visceral way. So
but these are also both verbs.
Right.
Shaming and guilt tripping.
Right.
So
right.
they have negative functions as well.
I think Hal, Ken, Chris, Sage, Andy.
Yeah, I was partly picking up on what Rob just said. In some disciplines, shame and guilt are treated as very different. And there's a lot of talk. One of the first books I read about early American history was called I don't know, it's about Southern so-called gentlemanly culture, and that's very shame-oriented. And let's see, antebellum Southern culture, which sort of came from old Scotch-Irish culture and Arab culture, are often pointed out, especially as shame cultures. And it doesn't matter that much what your intentions are. It's what you did on the surface that makes you shamed or not. In fact, if someone insults you and you don't respond, that's a cause for shame. And always called, the book was called Southern Honor, by the way. So as honor and shame are, counterparts.
Mhm.
To reclaim your honor, in the antebellum South, you might need to challenge someone to a duel. Or if they were inferior to them, you would, whip them with your whatever. Guilt, on the other hand, is described as being internal. And when the way people conceptualize things is in terms of guilt, saying you're sorry matters. If you're in a very shame-based culture, saying you're sorry may not matter.
That's very interesting. I think there is certainly shame is key in the operation of a honor culture. I always remember thinking, I'm going to date myself here, but years and years ago when the movie Love Story came out, and I think the tagline for that movie and the book was "Love means never having to say you're sorry," and I thought, no, it means frequently saying you're sorry. That was my reaction to that, but at any rate, let me see if I'm right in order here. I think Ken, Sage, Chris, and Andy, if I'm keeping track correctly. If you're Hank, is your hand still up, or did you want to put it down? I tried to put it down for you, but I couldn't do it. So
You're muted, Hank. I had pulled my hand down temporarily. I have a
okay,
couple of thoughts, but let other people who haven't spoken yet go.
okay. So Ken, I think we're at.
As I just said, I took my hand down. So
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just reading from a list that Sage put in the chat.
I'll come back
So
later.
I think Chris, you're muted.
Actually, Sage is next.
Okay,
and then
Sage,
me.
Chris, and Andy. Okay, thank you.
We're all trying to avoid the shame of
The
jumping
shame
line.
of jumping in.
I wanted to Ben, I wanted to share what you were just talking about, thinking of this from development and your kids and the stages of development. I've learned recently about 3 stages that have been identified of basically like how we learn to follow rules about behavior. And so the first is pliance, and that's basically rule following because of immediate, consequence, like, no, don't do that. And then, they do it. No, I told you not to do that. Tracking is next, and that's starting to understand the world in your environment and basically understanding, well, when I do that, they're going to say no. So I won't do it because of that. And then finally is augmenting, which is kind of where moral behavior and values come in. you're doing things because you're augmenting this with a new function. I make my bed because I want it to be nice, whatever. There's some reinforcement, and there could also be an avoidance of punishment. And so with kids, it's interesting because kids are at different stages. And so it's always a question at what time do you really start to worry, I guess. But I think this is interesting. And what's interesting is it still applies. We have the ability for augmenting and moral behavior, but so much of what we do could be considered tracking or appliance just as much. And I feel there's something there in terms of just like moral disgust theory of how we react. Like there's something about like moral behavior from an augmenting sense is good. Like you have a valued reason, you're doing this because you know it's right. That's a certain perspective. Moral behavior because of appliance or even tracking, where you're just doing things because of the consequences. That's more like compliance. It's different, right? That's where the word appliance comes from. So yeah. And this is I put this all in the backdrop of development and developmental phenotypic plasticity and how we shape our moral beliefs.
Well, thank you for that. I definitely could get into a whole subtopic of values and morals, and everybody has different ones, and they're attaching their guilt and shame to different morals and values, which causes conflict, within our own family on that front. The other thing I'll just throw into the pot, just if it stimulates conversation or not, is very actively with the sixth grader begging for a smartphone, and watch any one of the problems with cell phone technology and how it's changing group behavior and using shame and guilt to do self pornography and all the other things that are just rampant in middle school and in elementary school now too, as a parent especially. But we didn't grow up with that stuff, and so we weren't exposed to these things so early. But the whole idea of what you're doing with the psychological development of a child today has impact for the rest of their lives in the society. That is hot right now for my world. And so I'm very curious, coming to this conversation, very curious on that front. And so thank you for those 3 points that I'll kind of process into how I'm trying to frame scaffolding around. Thank you.
Ben, you may want to read Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Anxious Generation. Although there's been some criticism of that's worth reading as well, whether he's being overly alarmist. But at any rate, I think that's a great topic as well. I think at long last, Chris, you've been very patient.
No, that's fine. I love hearing everybody else. I just wanted to bring a little more to the forefront, building on what a couple of other people have said. I think Hank and Hal, maybe. While I would not want to live in a world without shame or guilt, I think we really need to pay attention to the way they are used to obtain and retain both individual and class power, and how they are applied disproportionately to women in terms of controlling their behavior, and also to the workforce, to racial groups, and how this spills. This also creates huge problems for victims, and how they feel about what's happened to them, despite the fact that they know something isn't their fault. They carry it forever and often, and so I just wanted to talk about how, bring up the important topic of the misuse of power through shame that is internalized as guilt, and that keeps people down and from finding their own power. And I think this is a huge challenge to the whole pro-social idea because you know, to get control, to change the people who are using shame and guilt to maintain their own power is an incredible challenge.
That's a really useful point. There's certainly a whole body of feminist literature about shame. And if you read sort of the psychotherapeutic literature, shame is usually talked about as a horrible thing we need to completely get rid of. The way I parse the difference is as I said in my introductory remarks, it has to do with whether it's excessive or not. But Chris, can I ask you a question? Do you think if women experience shame more often than men do, let's say that you'll agree with that assumption. How much of that do you think is hardwired for some reason, and how much of it is nurture and socialization? Is there any argument to be made that the sex differences in the experience of shame have any sort of a biological basis as opposed to a purely cultural basis?
I think there could be some of that. I mean, because of women's role as nurturers and the fact that, you know, if you don't feed that baby, maybe you should feel ashamed of yourself because that baby needs to be fed.
Okay.
So I get that, but I think a lot of it, the evolutionary angle, has to do with the physical power of men and the fact that acting in a submissive way is protective then for women, which does not make it right.
It's also protective for most men around powerful men too.
Oh, it might
Very
be protective for them around powerful men, but that's
right.
not who they abuse.
True. Yeah, good point. I think we are at Andy next. You're muted, Andy.
Interesting stuff. I just wanted to mention an early and maybe a crude version of Chris's point. In the Genealogy of Morals, Friedrich Nietzsche argues that there are two big dominant systems of morality in history, and that the master morality of the ancient Greeks and Romans used shame to control, where the aristocrats used shame to control the less powerful. And he interprets Christianity and sort of religious guilt as a mechanism by which the relatively powerless could fight back and guilt trip their enslavers, the masters, into being less, less draconian. So I think there's some problems with that theory, but there's also a lot of insight in it. I also just wanted to mention a really interesting little exchange that playing out in the chat. I was musing about the origins and function of shamelessness, and both Sage and Diane, I think, and Rob have made some really interesting observations. Among them that both guilt and shame seem to relate to norm transgression, for the most part, at least, to norm transgressions. So they're tools for navigating normatively structured environments, social environments, right? And shamelessness is a weird phenomenon that you might not expect to evolve, and yet we've been watching an utterly shameless politician in America get enormous support precisely because he's flouting norms and celebrating his own shamelessness, and they celebrate his shamelessness. So it's a really interesting phenomenon to think about how shamelessness can itself become a weapon, a political tool. I'll leave it there. Just
Sage made a really good point in response to that in the chat. I don't see it right in front of me, but I think Sage, you said basically that can also be used to sort of signal in-group virtue, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, if shamelessness, the fact that we feel shame and guilt at all, especially shame, is in relation to the group that is shaming us. So if you're shamelessness, what a strong signal that at your physiological experience level, you don't even react to these people. Like you just, they're so outgroup that you don't even feel shame from them. It's a strong signal that
It's a way of signaling that you reject the norms that are used to shame people, right? And so
And it's
if you
also
reject the norms of political correctness and just flout those norms, then that could be a signal to others who are chafe at political correctness norms.
right. I was gonna just the one level beyond who's affected by that shamelessness is the right signal of who they're really thinking of. Because there's also a whole group of people who are ambivalent about that shamelessness in the first place. So they're not really the out group, they're sort of periphery. So actually, I imagine it's probably much smaller, maybe on the extremes in terms of like who's at play, and we're all caught in the middle, sort of saying like, where am I? Yeah.
Really interesting stuff. I think Ken, Rob, Hank, and Hal.
Yeah, okay. In regard to that, what you have is the formation of another eusocial/tribal group. We're seeing that grouping activity, and you have one that doesn't, does, as you said, reject the morality of the other group. But at the same time, they do accept some of it, because you'll notice that nobody in the MAGA group says, he tried to steal the election and failed, but he should have. Everyone is saying, oh no, it was stolen from him, because they refuse to believe that he tried to steal it. So there is still some acceptance of the norm. But on another subject concerning whether or not shame and guilt are of value, certainly as notification that you may be transgressing, perhaps advanced environmental notification of transgression, guilt and shame might be valuable. But the problem is that guilt and shame usually are so strong that they reactively push behavior. They push behavior that is not considered in any sort of rational fashion. And therefore, in this case, that clearly should not be permitted. And one of the tools that's available for that, and I imagine it would be specifically in reaction to what Chris said, a tool that's available for that is mindfulness. And we all know I'm a big fan of that. If one is able to see oneself creating the guilt and the shame, then one can disassociate oneself from it and make a different kind of decision, which is more liberating.
And acceptance and commitment therapy uses the technique of diffusion, which is essentially the same thing. You distance yourself. Diane, I see your hand up too, but I think, and I'm going to ask everybody in the interest of time to try to keep your remarks as brief as possible so we don't go over by too much of the hour. I think Rob, Hank, Hal, Diane. You're muted, Rob.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I had two things. One was, well, I'll start with Trump. Trump is shameless, but he's on trial and he may be found guilty. So there are two operations going on at the same time there.
He won't experience guilt though.
No, but he may experience the consequences, possibly. I just wanted to mention a book I read a few years ago. It's not scientific. It's by a journalist named Pamela Drucker called Infidelity. And it's a kind of anecdotal account of various cultural attitudes towards infidelity. And the interesting thing to me about it was that some of the cultures were quite interesting. Like in Japan, they just don't talk about it. Everybody does it, but nobody talks about it. Russian men feel that they have the perfect right to be as unfaithful as they can, not the women. But the Americans chew over the infidelity for the rest of their lives. And I thought that was really interesting. There's something in American culture that just so interesting read.
Our Puritan heritage.
Yeah.
Did they mention the French at all in that book?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
Okay.
They're very polite about it.
Hal, Hank, Diane.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, Steve, you mentioned that maybe there was reason to think that empathy preceded guilt. And I think that that's probably true. There are 3 articles, and one of them, the last one, the one that was 8 pages, seemed very unempirical. And I've been paying a lot of attention to people who have tried to build, theoretical structures from the bottom up in various ways, like Michael Tomasello, largely from very extensive lab work and other experimental work, and Henrik through very intensive observation of, hunter-gatherer tribes. And the impression I get is that, well, empathy starts very early. Some forms of empathy predate 1 year. You can see that kids are judgmental toward the selfish acting puppet. When they see a puppet show, they're judgmental, and you can test that at just several months old from watching Iris.
Right, and that judgment is related to the other blaming emotions, which lead to shame and guilt.
Yeah, and then, like at age 3, kids are often playing games, and if somebody does it wrong, there's a lot of like third party enforcement against wrongs. You see some kid being treated badly, and somebody totally unconnected with it says, "Hey, don't do that," by age 3, very easily. It kind of fits with one of the CDPs, which says, let's start out by, politely pointing out what you did wrong, and then.
Well, Hal, you're making a really interesting point, which is that the focus of my remarks and the way Ev Psych tends to talk about this is more phylogenetic than ontogenetic. So how shame, empathy, guilt develop ontogenetically over the course of an individual lifespan is interesting, but less spoken to by evolutionary psychology than the phylogenetic evolution of it. But interesting stuff as well. Hank and Diane.
Okay, I wrote it up in the chat, so I don't know if people saw my comments, but the whole notion, I'm not sure if we put this in the ontogenic or phylogenetic, but about this numbing, or a kind of what I wrote is the term, I don't know if people come across it, a catatonoid response. That was researched primarily during after World War II, and the massive concentration camp final solution to everybody except whoever Hitler liked. And the catatonoid response is in nature, it's you have the predator, the lion chasing after a gazelle, and so we know something about the animal kingdom, that if the animal's dead, the excitement about the chase gets impeded for, like, I don't know, a micro millionth of a second. So I don't know what the numbers are, but every once in a while a gazelle gets away when they just freeze, shut down the mental and physiological mechanisms, stay alive just long enough to not die. And once in a while, I don't know, one every 2,000, 10,000, lion walks away, the gazelle gets up and runs away. So the freeze mechanism, or the numbing mechanism, or callousness. And what I see in individual work with people, a lot of people are kind of not callous, but cavalier, which is a form of this of this numbing response or this freeze response, that you're shut down the healthy aspects because it's too dangerous, and you operate from whatever the norms are don't count. You just want survival. So in that numbing response, you get collective numbing, like we see everywhere for thousands of years, but we have it now. And not to get into the social psychology or philosophy of it, but that numbing, that collective numbing, I think underlies a lot of what we're seeing in historically and now, where the cooperative, empathic, healthy shame, healthy signal guilt, so you do no harm, so you stay in the group. So I would say that that's a big factor on the both a biological level, the freeze,
Yep.
and the other.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's interesting, towards the end there, you use the phrase healthy shame and healthy guilt, which I think one of the themes of our conversation today has been there's healthy shame and healthy guilt and unhealthy shame and unhealthy guilt. Diane has been very patient, and then I think we're going to need to kind of wrap it up, and I'll mention we already have a topic picked for next month, and I think I have an idea for the following one I'll toss out. But go ahead, Diane.
Okay, well, I want to say something specifically with regard to what Chris said, but preface it by saying we talked about what are the triggers of shame and guilt, and the trigger of guilt is doing something or thinking about doing something or whatever, but trigger for shame is essentially rejection, or as the Santa Barbara people call it, devaluation. And there are many reasons why people might be rejected. It could be because they're different. It could be because they have violated a norm. But what you see in hierarchical systems is that having power is good and not having power is bad. And so if you want to know why women experience more shame than men do, it's because they have less power. I would say quite, grossly. But somehow we have that also functions to keep systems stable, because almost all human systems are to some extent hierarchical, and it maintains order for people to be ashamed and therefore passive about being out of power.
Mm-hmm.
Is a hypothesis.
Yeah,
Okay.
interesting comment, Diane. We're kind of at the noon hour, so I wanted to mention that last month we had actually chosen our topics for both April and May, and the topic we chose for May is another sort of related emotion to what we've been talking about today, which is disgust. So we're going to talk about disgust, and I have an article or two I think I can post about that, and sort of again the evolutionary function that disgust may play and how it came to be in our emotional repertoire, and we can go from there. And I'm going to put Diane on the spot here because I think she could lead a great discussion for us about norms and norm violations. In the paper that Diane and her co-authors published that I posted, she talks about several different, if you will, societal orders or moral orders in which what gets transgressed differs. And I think norms and norm transgression would be an interesting topic, Diane, if you're willing to do it, and if other people would find that an interesting topic as well. But I'm open to entertaining other suggestions too, of course. So Diane, is that something you would be willing to
I'd
do?
be happy to do it. Hal said a few things that made me think that he might be interested in contributing an idea or two.
Well, the two of you could
I don't know.
co-facilitate perhaps, but
Or,
are there
or
any
at
other?
least we could correspond.
Okay. Are there any other topics that
Yeah.
people are,
Sound interesting.
any other topics people are dying to toss out? Hank?
Not dying, but I keep thinking about overwhelming. I'm using the word trauma loosely because it's so, but when we're inundated with too much data, too much war, too much shaming, too much guilting, we're collectively affected, not just individually, but the sort of collective trauma that the catatoid response and how that from an evolutionary biology or a psychology point of view, because that's one
Okay.
of the threads I'm hearing today. And I'd like to look into it because I pay attention to it anyways.
Okay, we'll see if you can formulate that in
Yeah.
a little more finely tuned way.
Right.
And so I just wanted to, oh, he just left and I was going to wish him good luck with his kids. There's nothing more challenging than trying to raise responsible adults. So, at any rate, maybe he'll watch the video back and hear my good wishes. So I
Well,
want to thank,
Steve,
yes,
oh,
yes.
I just want to suggest in a place of humor that we can also take a look at, it's a little Monty Pythonish, but how do we raise irresponsible adults? Could be a good, interesting discussion about coming at it from a different paradoxical philosophical notion. Because we're doing a great job here, but we're not being, from my purpose, I love being absurd and using the Chuang
That's it.
Tzu as the,
That's an
what?
interesting way to come about it. It reminds me of one of my favorite books many years ago, kind of a cognitive psychology book, written by Dan Greenberg, and it was called How to Make Yourself Miserable.
Yes.
And each chapter was about something you could believe that if you believed it, you were guaranteed to be miserable. So it was a clever way to identify things one should not believe. And I remember there were chapters such as believe that life is fair, believe that
Right.
everyone should like you. If you believe those things, but it was a clever way to
Right.
do it.
But Steve,
We
if I
have
could Dan Greenberg is Jewish, like I am. I don't know, but that's in the sort of the Jewish protective mode about that kind of these paradoxical things.
yeah.
So as a Jew, I represent that if you like, but anybody else can do it too.
We haven't had a lot of topics about child development very much, so that might be interesting. But
My
thank
favorite
you.
my favorite bumper sticker reads, "Don't believe everything you think."
That's
So cognitive bias might
right. Yeah.
No, I
But
would say believe everything you think, right, Andy?
I'm
I mean,
afraid
we're not talking.
I'm
we're not
afraid I'm with
talking
Ken
about-
on this one, Hank. Sorry.
Okay, well, everybody, thank you very much for coming. We had a great turnout. This obviously was an interesting topic, and we'll do discussed in May, and norms with Diane and Hal in June, and then we can think about some of these other ideas that have been tossed out at that point.
Disgusting. Yeah.
Thanks for coming, everyone. Yep.
Normal.
Bye now.
Everyone.